The morning air over the Akagi tasted of hot metal and salt, when Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stepped onto the windswept deck and watched certainty die by fire. Smoke rose in greasy pillars, gulls shrieked and vanished, and the carrier that had once been a floating promise of Japanese supremacy now groaned like a wounded animal. For months, Japan's carrier arm, the proud Kido Butai, had run wild across 2 oceans. Now, in what felt like the span of a few heartbeats, that confidence was collapsing. Fuchida appendix stitches tight beneath his tunic, pride tighter gripped the rail as another concussion rolled through the hull. He knew what many aboard would not yet say: they had underestimated their enemy. Hours earlier in the wardroom, the world had still made sense. Maps lay smoothed by careful hands, compasses clicked, teacups rattled with each measured turn, and Admiral Chuichi Nagumo permitted the smallest of smiles. The doctrine was sound, the pilot sublime, the enemy predictable. Since the 1,920 the Imperial Japanese Navy had shaped a cutting edge. Carrier concentration, synchronized strike waves, and aviators trained for years until muscle memory felt like destiny. By 1942, Japanese carrier pilots averaged roughly 700 hours in the air, their American counterparts closer to 200. The A6M0 danced where American fighters lumbered. Quantity might be the American answer, the officers told themselves. Quality, Japanese quality, would be the counter. From the hangar below, Petty Officer Sato Tomohiro, fictional but true to 1,000 men like him, scribbled between orders in a sweat-curled notebook. Smell of aviation fuel. Boots slide on paint blistered by Sunday. We are ready. We are always ready. Above him, ordnance crews moved with ritual precision. Bombs trundled on dollies, torpedoes secured with webbing and prayer. It felt like ceremony, the practiced sequence that had humbled battleships at Pearl Harbor and shattered fleets, from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. Yet those same victories planted a seed of error. After the Doolittle raid in April, Hornet, an Enterprise flinging bombers at Tokyo from audacious range, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto turned humiliation into a baited trap. Draw the Americans to Midway and annihilate what was left of their carriers. The plan was immense, almost operatic. 8 task forces, 272 ships strung across the Pacific like steel constellations. Yamamoto's battleships trailed far behind the carriers, the old decisive battle dream still breathing, waiting for a climactic gun duel that never came. It was a masterpiece on paper, and a mosaic of risk in the open sea. On another island far to the east, the air in Station HYPO's basement was cooler, lined with chalk dust and cigarette haze. Radio man First Class Mac Halperin, another composite voice, listened to fragments of JN-25 code and the scratch of pencils. Commander Joseph Rocheford's team had pried open the Japanese cipher just enough to glimpse intent. AF was Midway. Hypo's verdict: let Admiral Chester Nimitz turn math into strategy, placing Enterprise, Hornet, and the bruised but buoyant Yorktown northeast of the atoll. American industry had already intervened in the shadows. Pearl Harbor's crews patching Yorktown in days, not months, welding rods flashing through the night as if speed itself were a weapon. On the Akagi, doctrine still ruled: hold half the air group in reserve, flex to land or sea targets, as reports dictate. When a scout plane misreported and then amended its sighting enemy ships, maybe a carrier, the neatness unraveled. Rearming orders went out and were reversed. Bombs returned to magazines, torpedoes hauled up again. Fuel hoses snaked, carts rattled, men hurried. Petty Officer Sato wrote once more: change, change again. Deck grows crowded, heat stings the eyes. Flexibility became fragility. None of this felt dangerous to the senior officers. Not yet. Their ledger of the war, Singapore, the Indian Ocean, the Philippines, told them American carriers were few, their crews green, their doctrine unrefined. Intelligence estimates said the enemy might muster 2 carriers at most. Many believed they'd be too cautious to hazard them. That belief would prove as combustible as any fuel line. Across the ocean, a different ledger filled. In the 6 months since Pearl Harbor, the United States had accelerated mobilization to a pace that dwarfed prior wars. The Brooklyn Navy Yard pulsed with 3 shifts and 70,000 workers. Newport News hammered together new Essex-class keels, timetables sliced in half, rivets hissing like rain. The difference wasn't merely numbers, it was tempo repairs completed in days, training pipelines widened, tactics iterated at combat speed. "Baling wire and chewing gum," Yorktown's captain quipped, "but ships don't fight on style points. They fight on whether their decks can turn the wind into sorties." Back aboard the Akagi, the first low, stubborn American attacks from Midway itself arrived like sandflies, annoying, not lethal, forcing defensive maneuvers that ate minutes in focus. Minutes matter when your decks are crowded and your decision cycle is slipping. A pilot from the Zero Cap later remembered, and thousands like him would have agreed, "We were kings at 30,000 feet. The battle called us down." At that hour, no one on either side could yet see the shape of the next 5 minutes, the hinge of the Pacific War. But the conditions were forming. A fleet sure of its doctrine, a deck cluttered by indecision made under pressure, and an enemy who had traded blood for position, time for altitude, secrecy for surprise. Strategy had pulled the picture into focus. Fate would let gravity finish the shot. The morning of June 4th, 1942 unfolded like a cruel test of endurance. Admiral Nagumo stood in Akagi's command center, eyes darting between reports, returning strike group from Midway clamoring to land, the reserve aircraft half rearmed, and the scouts' ambiguous warning of enemy carriers. Doctrine demanded clarity, but clarity was absent. To delay meant crowding flight decks with planes, fuel, and explosives. To launch hastily meant risking aircraft with the wrong ordnance. In this crucible of minutes, hesitation became lethal. From the deck, pilots fresh from Midway's raid circled anxiously above the carriers, fuel gauges dipping lower, cockpits reeking of sweat and exhaust. Below, armorers worked with frantic precision, cursing as bomb dollies rolled back into elevators, and torpedoes were heaved once more toward the surface. It was choreography without rhythm, the tempo broken by conflicting orders. One petty officer later recalled in a memoir, "The hangar smelled of gasoline and cordite. It felt less like preparation, and more like waiting for a match to fall." Meanwhile, the Americans were already moving. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, knew the odds. His men flew obsolete TBD Devastators, slow and underarmed. He is remembered to have told his squadron, "If there's only one plane left to make a final run, I want that man to go in and get a hit." His words were prophecy. 15 Devastators skimmed across the sea, low and deliberate, and Japanese fighters tore into them with ruthless efficiency. Waldron's entire squadron was obliterated. Only one man survived. No torpedo struck home, but courage had bought time. On the Yorktown, Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey led Torpedo Squadron 3 inches of parallel charge, again, slaughter. Anti-aircraft guns rattled, Zeros scythed through formation, and nearly every plane fell into the sea. Enterprise's Eugene Lindsay fared no better. Dozens of Americans perished in fire and salt water, and still no hits were scored. From the Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo himself reportedly remarked to his staff, "I have never seen such courage in the face of certain death. But courage alone cannot overcome superior force." He did not know that those desperate attacks had stripped his defense bare. The Zero Combat Air Patrol, lured to wave-top altitudes, had left the skies above the carriers exposed. It was in this thin airspace at 18,000 feet that Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey's dive bombers appeared, 33 dauntless aircraft from Enterprise. Alongside him, Yorktown's dive bombers under Maxwell Leslie arrived like fate aligned. Their timing was almost divine, fuel hoses still stretched across decks, aircraft loaded with bombs, and torpedoes lined like tinder, officers still debating which targets to strike next. From that altitude, the carriers looked less like predators, and more like bloated prey. McCluskey nosed into his dive. The Dauntless screamed downward, wings shuddering, pilots grunting against the G-force. Lieutenant Richard Best selected the Akagi. In his later recollection, he thought only, "This is for Pearl Harbor." His bomb struck true, detonating in the hangar among fueled planes, and the flagship erupted in fire. 3 bombs smashed into Kaga, igniting infernos across its length. Leslie's squadron gutted Soryu in similar fashion. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's proud carriers had been transformed into floating pyres. Flames leapt skyward, black smoke blotting the horizon, sailors running blind through firestorms of aviation fuel. Survivors would later call it hell on water. Only Hiryu remained, temporarily spared. With desperate resolve, she launched counterattacks that struck Yorktown, setting her ablaze. But Hiryu's reprieve was brief. American dive bombers returned in the afternoon and found her too. Soon, she too burned. Another giant, gutted by explosions. By dusk, the pride of the Kido Butai lay shattered. 4 carriers lost, over 300 aircraft destroyed, and irreplaceable veteran pilots gone to the depths. Nagumo's officers stood on tilted decks, their faces ashen in the glow of fire. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, refusing evacuation, chose to remain aboard Hiryu, declaring he would share his men's fate. For the Americans, the cost was brutal, but bearable. The Yorktown, already wounded at Coral Sea, succumbed after repeated strikes, and 147 American aircraft were lost. Yet the balance sheet of the day defied belief. 4 Japanese fleet carriers annihilated for the loss of 1 American. It was more than a tactical victory. It was a seismic shift in the war. Admiral Yamamoto, hundreds of miles away aboard the Yamato, received the reports in silence. His staff noted that he neither raged nor wept. He simply acknowledged that the heart of Japan's carrier force was gone. "This is not a tactical defeat," Lieutenant Commander Watanabe wrote in his diary that night. "This may well be the turning point of the entire war." Night fell heavy over the Pacific, but the glow of burning carriers lit the horizon like floating funeral pyres. For men like Petty Officer Sato, who clung to the rails of a rescue destroyer after abandoning the Akagi, the air was thick with oil smoke and grief. He scribbled in his notebook with blistered hands, "We were the sword of the Emperor. Now, we are shadows." Around him, other survivors shivered in silence, staring at the water where their comrades had vanished. The ocean, once a vast expanse of Japanese dominance, now felt like an enemy swallowing everything. The psychological shock ran deeper than the tactical loss. For decades, Japan's naval doctrine had been built on qualitative superiority: fewer ships, but better trained crews, sharper tactics, and an iron belief in fighting spirit. That doctrine had been vindicated at Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean. But Midway shattered the illusion. American aviators, once derided as clumsy novices, had pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. American repair yards had turned Yorktown from crippled wreck to fighting carrier in mere days, an engineering feat the Japanese could scarcely imagine. American intelligence, once dismissed as primitive, had read their intentions with uncanny accuracy. Every assumption about will, skill, and industry had proved disastrously wrong. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff received the reports with disbelief. Initial communiques softened the blow, claiming 2 American carriers sunk for the loss of 1 Japanese. Only gradually did fragments of the truth seep through. Emperor Hirohito, when finally informed of the scale, is said to have asked quietly, "How could this happen to the invincible combined fleet?" No one had an answer that could salvage pride. For Yamamoto, the admiral who had warned after Pearl Harbor that he had only awakened a sleeping giant, the nightmare was becoming real. In silence aboard the Yamato, he canceled the planned invasion of Midway and withdrew the armada. Ambitions of seizing New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa vanished overnight. From that moment forward, Japan would never again seize the strategic initiative in the Pacific. But the most devastating loss was not measured in steel or ships, it was measured in men. The aviators who went down with Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were the product of a system that had invested years into each pilot. Some had honed their skills since the 1930s in China, their instincts sharpened through endless training flights and combat sorties. Unlike the Americans, who rotated veterans home to train replacements, Japan kept its aces at the front until death claimed them. Midway claimed hundreds at once, a generation of expertise that could never be rebuilt. Even those who survived bore scars that dulled their edge. Lieutenant Takashi Agusa, one of Japan's finest dive bomber pilots, would never fully recover from his wounds. Others, like Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the morning strike on Midway, perished outright. The Americans moved differently. Within weeks of Midway, new flight training centers were opening across the United States, multiplying like factories themselves. By 1943, the U.S. Navy would train more than 20,000 pilots annually, each averaging 450 hours in the air before combat. Japan's dwindling resources meant its replacements often arrived with barely 300 hours, sometimes less. By 1944, the balance of skill had reversed as sharply as the balance of numbers. Where once the Zero had outmaneuvered every American fighter, now Hellcats and Corsairs tore through formations of inexperienced Japanese pilots who lacked both training and mentorship. Industry told the same story. In the 18 months after Midway, American shipyards launched 9 Essex-class fleet carriers and 9 light carriers, each a floating airfield bristling with power. By 1944, the U.S. carrier force would outnumber every other navy combined. Japan, strained by resources and submarine blockades, managed only 3 new fleet carriers in the entire war. At Brooklyn Navy Yard, 70,000 workers labored under floodlights around the clock. At Newport News, hulls rose like towers, cranes swinging steel with relentless rhythm. In Japan, shortages of steel, fuel, and skilled labor throttled construction. Submarines, prowling supply routes, made even replacement efforts perilous. For the officers who had believed in invincibility, the recognition was brutal. Commander Masataki Okumiya, who survived Soryu, later reflected, "We built our strategy on the belief that Japanese skill would outweigh American quantity. Midway destroyed not only our ships, but this belief itself." That realization spread like a shadow through the officer corps, a creeping awareness that their war had shifted from one of expansion to one of attrition, a contest Japan could not win. In the weeks that followed Midway, American intelligence intercepted fragments of Japanese communications messages in which stunned officers confessed that their assumptions had been shattered. One staff officer wrote bluntly, "We must reconsider our entire strategic concept. The Americans can replace losses faster than anticipated and demonstrate tactical innovations we did not expect. If this trend continues, our prospects diminish." For a navy that had once toasted to certain victory, the admission was extraordinary. Midway had not simply broken ships. It had broken faith in the very foundations of Japanese strategy. The industrial disparity was becoming undeniable. By the summer of 1942, while Japan struggled to replace its losses, the United States already had 27 aircraft carriers under construction. The Essex class, ordered before the war but now accelerated, displaced over 27,000 tons, and could launch more than 90 aircraft, each larger, faster, and more resilient than the carriers Japan had lost. Behind them came a swarm of destroyers, submarines, and auxiliary vessels, each hammer strike echoing America's transformation into the arsenal of democracy. Japanese planners, once dismissive of American resolve, now watched shipyards outproduce their own entire fleet in months. Among survivors of Midway, the shift in spirit was palpable. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, a Zero pilot who had fought at both Pearl Harbor and Midway, later recalled, "After Pearl Harbor, we believed we were invincible. After Midway, we understood we were defeated, though the war would continue for 3 more years." He was not alone. Many officers knew, even if they could not say aloud, that Japan's strategic window had closed. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations for the United States, would later write in his memoirs, "Midway was the first decisive defeat suffered by the Japanese Navy in 350 years. It stopped their expansion and put them on the defensive. From a strategic point of view, it was the most important battle of the Pacific War. For sailors like Petty Officer Sato, however, strategy was too distant a concept. What mattered were the faces missing from the mess hall, the empty bunks, the silence where laughter had been." Rescued from the Akagi, he remembered watching survivors hauled aboard destroyers, their uniforms torn, their eyes hollow. Some whispered prayers, others stared at their hands as if ashamed they still lived. He wrote in his notebook, "The sea took our carriers, It took our pride. Now we carry only ghosts." His words echo the lived reality beneath the grand strategies and communiques a generation of men asked to believe in invincibility, only to discover that courage and sacrifice could not replace steel and fuel. On the American side, the victory was heralded cautiously at first. President Roosevelt wished to trumpet the news to rally morale, but naval leaders persuaded him to delay, fearful of revealing just how thoroughly U.S. codebreakers had pierced Japanese plans. When the announcement finally came on June 6, it framed the triumph as the product of courage and determination, rather than intelligence. The public embraced it wholeheartedly. Newspapers hailed Midway as proof that the tide had turned, that Pearl Harbor's humiliation was being avenged. For American families who had buried sons in the Philippines or endured rationing at home, it was a moment of vindication. Factories roared louder, war bonds sold faster, and the phrase, "Don't give up the ship," became more than a slogan, it was a creed. Yet beneath the celebration lay sacrifice. The torpedo squadrons, annihilated almost to a man, became symbols of duty carried through to the bitter end. Admiral Nimitz, in his report, wrote that their courage had set the stage for victory. They pressed home their attacks in the face of tremendous anti-aircraft fire and overwhelming fighter opposition. They were living examples of our Navy's spirit. Those words gave comfort to grieving families, but they also served as a reminder. Midway had been won not by miracle alone, but by men willing to die in order to open the skies for others. By the end of June, the contrast between the two nations was stark. America was accelerating building, training, innovating. Japan was already beginning to conserve, to ration, to fight with what remained. Though the war's fiercest battles still lay ahead, Guadalcanal, the Marianas, Leyte Gulf, the momentum had shifted permanently. Midway was not the end of the Pacific War, but it was the moment when the future became visible. For those who survived it, whether Japanese or American, the battle left scars deeper than steel, scars of pride, loss, and the realization that empires built on overconfidence can vanish in minutes. In Tokyo's naval circles, the reckoning after Midway was harsh and deeply personal. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical mind behind Pearl Harbor, had once scoffed at American carriers as clumsy and second-rate. Now, with 4 of Japan's finest ships at the bottom of the Pacific, he argued for reform with unusual urgency. His July 1942 report called for accelerated carrier construction, the rotation of combat pilots into training posts, and the development of new aircraft to counter America's growing strength. But his words were drowned out by shortages of steel, fuel, and time. The empire that had struck so boldly at Pearl Harbor was already trapped in a war of attrition it could not sustain. For Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the commander of the Kido Butai, the defeat never loosened its grip. Once lionized for leading the Pearl Harbor strike, he carried Midway like a shadow that grew heavier with each passing year. When American forces landed on Saipan in 1944 and overwhelmed its defenses, Nagumo chose ritual suicide rather than capture. His final message admitted what others feared to say. The defeat at Midway was the beginning of our end. I go now to apologize to the spirits of our aviators who fell that day. His words capture the weight of a battle that became less a single event than a turning point for an entire nation's destiny. Among surviving officers, some clung to old illusions that spirit and bravery could still balance industrial might. Yet even the most devoted began to sense that the war had shifted beyond recovery. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, reflecting after the war, wrote, "We convinced ourselves the American fighting man was soft. Midway proved his courage was equal to ours. We convinced ourselves their industrial power was exaggerated. Midway was the first demonstration of its true scale. It was an admission not just of defeat, but of the blindness that had brought it about." For Americans, Midway became legend. In the years after, veterans spoke of it with awe. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons, the miraculous timing of the dive bombers, the fragile Yorktown that fought on despite crippling damage. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, whose bomb crippled the Akagi, would never fly again, his lungs scarred from inhaling fumes during the battle. Decades later, he admitted, "The Japanese pilots were probably better than we were, and they had better aircraft. But we had surprise, teamwork, and the belief that we could win. That made the difference. His reflection distilled the essence of Midway, not perfection, but determination backed by an industrial machine that refused to falter. The Japanese public would not know the full truth until after 1945. Wartime announcements spoke of victories or, at worst, temporary setbacks. Only fragments of the disaster trickled through. But within the Navy, the officers who had stood on burning decks knew what propaganda could not hide. Midway had stripped Japan of its initiative. From expansion, the empire turned to defense. From confidence to desperation. Every battle afterward, Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Philippine Sea, was fought on borrowed time. The historical weight of those 5 minutes, when American dive bombers turned carriers into blazing wrecks, cannot be overstated. In that narrow window, the Pacific War pivoted. The Japanese, who had raised glasses in a toast to American carriers the night before battle, discovered that their contempt had built the very trap that ensnared them. For the Americans, the victory was not a miracle of chance, but the convergence of intelligence breakthroughs, evolving tactics, industrial power, and unyielding courage. What seemed improbable was, in hindsight, inevitable. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who survived Akagi and later lived to see Japan's surrender, perhaps put it best. In his post-war writings, he admitted, "At Midway, we lost more than 4 carriers. We lost our sense of invincibility. We lost the initiative. And most fatally, we lost our illusions." His words echo beyond the decks of burning ships, beyond the wrecks that rest at the bottom of the Pacific. They capture the essence of Midway as both a military turning point and a philosophical reckoning. The moment when Japan's war of conquest met the hard reality of an industrial democracy, awakened to total war. For the United States, Midway was vindication. For Japan, it was prophecy fulfilled that the sleeping giant, once stirred, would wield a power too great to resist. And in the long shadow of those 5 minutes, the course of the Pacific War and the fate of nations was set.